Hello and welcome to InfoCon 2023. I'm Lori Haid. I am Director of Student Services at the School of Information and Library Science at UNC Chapel Hill. And I'm very excited to introduce our speaker for tonight, Dr. Rob Capra.
Hello, I'm going to go ahead and take over the screen sharing here and let me know if everybody can see that okay. Is that showing just my slide or is that showing the whole screen?
I'm seeing the slide and some of your backdrop on your computer.
Right, how about that? We'll do it that way.
Yes, that is just your
perfect
slide.
All right. Well, it's great to see everybody here today. My name is Rob Capra. I'm a professor here at the School of Information and Library Science at UNC Chapel Hill. And I'm excited to present tonight on how ChatGPT and other types of AI, generative AI services are changing the way people search for information. And I'm going to talk to you about how some of these technologies work and some of the studies that we've been doing here to look at how they impact how people search for information. I think that Lori is going to help me out. If you guys have questions, Lori, yep, I'm going to thumbs up. You can filter those into the chat, and Lori will help me with those. But other than that, I'm just going to go ahead and get started. So a little bit about my background. So I am here at UNC Chapel Hill. I've did work at the University of Washington University in St. Louis. Did my PhD at Virginia Tech. I also worked for Southwestern Bell for a while. And a lot of my work focuses on building and studying interfaces for how people use and find information. And so this is kind of at the intersection of information retrieval and human-computer interaction. I'm very fortunate to be at UNC Chapel Hill, which is one of the top-ranked LIS programs in the US or in the world. We've got bachelor's, master's, PhD, and postmaster's programs here. Lots of exciting research going on in the areas that I've listed. And so I hope some of you guys will seek us out if you're interested in doing work with us. So recently, OpenAI sort of dropped a bomb on the world in the form of ChatGPT. Maybe somebody you know has been talking about it. It seems like it was all that my friends could talk about all summer, was the impacts of ChatGPT on the world. And so I want to take just a few minutes here and talk about what ChatGPT is doing and what OpenAI is and what the different kinds of services are. So when we talk about ChatGPT, that's a service being provided by company OpenAI. The GPT part stands for Generative Pre-trained Transformer. So generative in the sense that it generates text as output, or in other cases, it can generate pictures and images and things like that. But we're talking about ChatGPT, focuses mostly on text. Pre-trained, because it's been pre-trained on a large corpus of text. And in the case of ChatGPT, it was trained on a common crawl of the web. So a crawl that was done, looked at lots and lots of pages on the internet. It was also trained on some books databases and on some database from Wikipedia. The transformer is the part of the AI architecture that's doing the work. And so that's where we get the GPT part. So ChatGPT 3.5 was released back in November of last year and really kind of caught the world by storm. It caught a lot of people off guard. We weren't expecting it. It acquired over 100 million users in just 2 months, which makes it one of the really fast growing services out there. And as I said, there were a lot of people in the community that I think were caught off guard by the release of ChatGPT. They didn't know that that was going to happen. Then GPT-4 was released in March of this year, and it's an even bigger model. So whereas ChatGPT was trained on about 175 billion parameters, It's estimated that GPT-4 is on about a 1.7 trillion parameters. It claims that it has less hallucinations and greater alignment, and it also has some image processing capabilities. And so we'll talk about all of that here during the presentation. One of the things that GPT-4 can do that GPT 3.5 didn't do was it can handle images as input. And so this is an example of an image that was provided as input here over on the right-hand side of the screen. And the output that GPT produced over on the left hand is shown. So what we asked was, what is funny about this image? And can you describe it panel by panel? And so if you look at this, it's kind of funny because it has a modern day smartphone and a really old school VGA monitor connector plugged into it. And that's just, it's silly because you don't expect to see a VGA connector plugged into a smartphone. And so the output from GPT actually explains that. It's a smartphone with a VGA connector, and it talks about what is in panel 2. And then in panel 3, it talks about how the VGA connector actually has a lightning connector on it, and that's how it's plugging in. And then it explains that the humor is because this is kind of an absurd thing to think about. And so this is a really impressive feat that GPT-4 can process an image like this and not only explain what's in it, but also talk about what the humor behind it was. There's lots and lots of generative AI tools out there. I'm sure that some of you guys have used these or worked with these. There's tools to generate text. There's tools for generating images like Stable Diffusion or DALL-E. There are code partners that can help you to write code, co-pilots, things like that. Lots of systems out there that now do video and voice and music as well. So it's a big ecosystem. Some of you guys have probably seen that generative AI has been incorporated into search engines. So Microsoft made a big splash with the new Bing earlier this year. And it basically puts the OpenAI ChatGPT technology side by side with the results from a web search engine. And so you can have a chat over on one side and you can be doing web search on the other side. Google also has a similar kind of system, Google Bard. Some of you guys may have seen that one. Again, it does similar kinds of things. You can pose questions to it and it generates output, and then you can have a follow-up conversation with it. Google has also incorporated this technology into some of their search engine pages. So the other day I went and did a search for information science on Google, and it popped up a little thing that said, do you want to see generative AI about this? And I said, yes, and it generated the text that you see here. And so this is a nice, description of what information science is. And then it even puts over here on the side some little icons that have UNC and University of Michigan and some other iSchools. Okay. Now, there are a lot of risks and challenges in using these technologies, and these have been talked about a lot in the news lately. There's issues of privacy. When you submit information to the generative AI system, what is it doing with that? Is that information getting rolled back into its model in some way? And we're starting to see efforts to create versions of those systems where, for the enterprise, they're making guarantees about your information is not going to be rolled back into the model. There's issues of ethics here, right? So if I use a generative AI system to write some text for me, that generative AI system was trained on text, and I don't really know what that text was. And so how do I know that I'm not plagiarizing somebody else's work when I use a generative AI system? There's lots of issues of bias and potential discrimination because we know that the texts that these were trained on may not be representative of everything that's out there. They were trained on certain kinds of web data, certain kinds of books, and if there's information that wasn't contained in those training data sets, then there may be bias in them. These systems also are prone to hallucinations. So hallucinations are when the system just sort of whole cloth makes up something that's just not there or not true or not the case. And we see these in these generative AI systems quite a bit. There's also issues of alignment. Now, alignment talks about how well the system aligns with what we're asking it to do, what its output aligns with what we've asked it to do. So if you remember a minute ago, I had this slide where I asked it to tell me a story about a frog who visits New York City and loves pizza. Okay, silly thing. But it created this nice little story about a frog who went and had pizza in New York City, and it changed his world, and it was wonderful and great. And so that's the nice kind of, if I ask somebody to tell me a story, this story kind of aligns with what I would maybe want to have come back. Alignment can go wrong sometimes, though. So if alignment goes wrong, imagine that this was a really dark story about a frog that went to New York City and went bad and had some pizza and did terrible things. And, that's not what I wanted to hear about. So that's an alignment problem, right? So how well does the output that's coming back from the system align with our expectations? And in the case of a silly story like that, maybe it's not such a big deal, but in other cases, it is a big deal. All right.
Rob,
Yeah.
we've had several people ask. I know we are recording, and I know that recording will be shared with everyone who's registered today. People are asking if your slides will also be available. So that's your choice. So
I am not sure that I can make all of them available, but I can make some of them available.
Thank you.
Okay. So you may have heard back over the summer, earlier this year, people were calling for a pause to some of this work. And there was a really famous letter that was sent out last spring by a bunch of researchers and technologists that signed on and said, hey, we're in an arms race here to create these new generative AI systems, and we don't fully understand how they work and what they do. We need to slow down. And so they said, hey, we should take a pause here. I will say that pause really hasn't seemed to happen. But there are a lot of people that are expressing concerns about how fast we're going with these technologies. And so I think that's something that we all need to keep in mind when we think about generative AI and how it's impacting people and their search practices. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about traditional web search versus generative AI. And, I know this is a information science audience, so some of this may be familiar to you guys, but I just want to make sure we're all kind of on the same page here. So if you have a traditional set of search results that come back from a web search engine, say I was interested in finding out about Machu Picchu. I have an information need. I want to know about Machu Picchu. I type in my query. Google goes off and finds a bunch of documents that match my query and shows those documents to me. And not only does it show me the document, but it shows me where it's coming from. It shows me the title of the document. It shows me a snippet of text from the document. And in this case, it even shows me a nice little picture from the document. And so I've got a lot of rich information here that I could use to assess that information, think, is this information that I want to read? Is it relevant to me? Do I trust this information? I can look at it and say, oh, it's the History Channel. Okay, I recognize that. They're a reasonable information source. Maybe I trust them. Or Encyclopedia Britannica. Okay, I've heard of them. I trust them. I'll look at their information. So traditional search engines give us a lot of information to work with. But I have to synthesize and read through all this information on my own and sort of make my own sense of it. Now, on the right side over here, I'm showing you what Google Bard produced. And so it gave me this nice little blurb of text about Machu Picchu and when it was built and where it was located and various things about it. So I can read that, and it's done a great job of synthesizing all this information for me. But I don't know where this information is coming from. I don't know if this information is true or false. And I don't have a real clear way to assess the information, right? It says that it was built around 1450 AD. But I don't know where that information is coming from or if it's accurate, and I can't go verify it for myself. So there's trade-offs here, right? So one thing that people have been trying to do is incorporate more ability for people to verify the information that's being output by generative AI systems. So here's an example of a system that, let me see if I can find how to do the little pointer control. Yeah, I can't find the pointer control. Anyway, over here on the right side, where it's talking about the James Webb Space Telescope, you'll see in there that it has a place where it says Eagle Nebula 1, 2. And what it's doing there is it's trying to say, I've got citations that I can use for those, for the claim that was just made. And the cited web pages are being shown down below. Number 1 is a NASA site, number 2 is a CNN site. And then it goes on and it talks about how this telescope is going to be used in the next phase, and it's got a citation for that for nasa.gov. That's number 3. So these kinds of things can be helpful, but they're not always accurate, right? So generative AI systems sometimes hallucinate things, and sometimes they hallucinate sources and citations. And so one of the things that we can look at when we try to evaluate these outputs from the systems are not just, is it fluid and easy to read, or is it useful to me, but are the statements that it's making actually backed up by citations? And are those citations actually correct, right? So we can look at both those things. How many statements are backed up by a citation, and how many citations are actually verifiably correct? So some people did this. This is a study that I have cited down here at the bottom of the screen, and found that in the study they did, about 51% of the generated sentences were fully supported with citations, and 74% of those citations actually supported the sentences. So, right? Not the best. Right? If my slides only had citations on 50% of the slides, and only 75% of my citations were accurate, you guys would be running me off of the presentation and telling me that I was, spreading false information. And so that's an issue that we have to work on in these systems. Another thing that happens in these systems is that there is sort of this sound of authority that comes, right? The text is very fluent, the text is very logical, it's easy to read, and it makes it sound like the text is authoritative. And it can create this sort of facade of trustworthiness that may mislead users. It sounds good, maybe it is right. Okay. I want to shift now and talk a little bit about how generative technologies have been doing on some standardized kind of tests. So these are academic and professional exams listed down at the bottom, things like the AP English test or the chemistry test or the GRE or that sort of thing. And what you can see here is the blue line is showing you the performance of ChatGPT 3.5. And then the green is showing you what GPT-4 did above and beyond that. And so GPT-4 really made some substantial gains on things like these standardized tests. And if you look at a lot of these, a lot of these are scoring at above 80%. And so we could sort of think that the generative technology is getting a passing grade on a lot of these standardized tests, which is pretty impressive. One in particular that I'll focus on here for a little bit is I want to talk about the use of GPT in the medical community. And so interestingly, GPT 3.5 almost passes the US medical licensing exam. It's interesting because that's a pretty tough exam. People go to school for years and have, trouble passing that exam. GPT-4 got even better. So these 85, 83%, these were doing even better with the GPT-4 model. So that sort of brings up an interesting point. If it's doing so well on these medical exams, how would it do with actual medical diagnoses? And this is something that people have started to look into. So as you present the case of someone that's come into a doctor's office or a hospital, and describe the situation of the patient and their stats and all of these things, can the GPT system come up with an accurate diagnosis? And in many cases, it can. Now, the medical domain is a really interesting one because there's so much at stake, right? We don't want there to be mistakes in a medical diagnosis. And so people have started to explore the use of these technologies in clinical practice, but there are a lot of concerns that are very justified. Okay. So, what kinds of things are people talking about using this in? They're using it clinical decision support. They're using it to generate differential diagnosis lists. They're using it to help answer medical questions. And then also to try to think about ways to use it to generate medical notes and patient release letters and things like that. And all of these are things, though, that would need verification, right? If you're going to generate the release notes or discharge summaries for a patient, a doctor needs to sign off on that, right? So people are exploring this, and there's a lot of concerns, but they're looking into it. I'll share a couple studies that have been done recently in this area with you guys. So one looked at a bunch of clinical vignettes of patients and found that the overall accuracy of the GPT 3.5 was about 71%, which seems pretty good. But if you sort of think about, if I went to my doctor and their accuracy was 71%, I might have some concerns. And so, even small errors in a medical diagnosis can make a very big difference. And so we have to be very careful when we think about using these systems in those contexts. Another one that I'll point out in the medical context that I think is kind of interesting, there's a forum on Reddit. Some of you guys may have seen this forum on Reddit. It's called Ask a Doc. And you go onto Reddit and you type in whatever your medical question is, and there are actual medical doctors who respond on Reddit. I'm not really quite sure how the legality of all that works, but they somehow figured it out. So real doctors actually respond. So what this study did was it took the doctors' responses on Reddit, and then it took the same descriptions and it fed them into a chatbot. And then they took all those and showed them to people and said, which ones do you prefer? And it turns out that people preferred the chatbot responses over the real doctor's responses. They rated them as being more empathetic. The chatbot wrote more text. They thought the quality was higher, all of these kinds of things. So what does that mean? Maybe these systems have some role in helping us in domains like medicine. Maybe we don't want to let them take over, but maybe they have a role. Okay. So again, I can't emphasize enough, though, the risks and challenges that are present in these kind of systems, especially where they are now. And so one of the things that I want to sort of talk about is the need for human involvement and review. So a lot of systems right now that do generative AI can produce some impressive looking output, but because of the hallucinations and because of the alignment issues, they're going to require human review to make sure that the things that are coming out of them are what we want to send to the next stage of whatever that process is. And so there are questions there about how do you do that and how much effort does that take? And would that potentially take more effort than just generating it from an expert in the first place? There are all kinds of things that we can talk about with regard to standards and accuracy of the systems, reliability of the systems, whether or not they can be interpreted and explain what they've done in their reasoning. There are definitely going to be new standards and new regulations, I think, that come out around that field. but there are plenty of existing standards that can be used too, especially in established fields like medicine and legal profession and so on. And then finally on this slide, I really do think we're going to find that regulatory agencies and organizations are going to have a lot to say about how these technologies are used in various professional fields. So moving a little bit closer to our space of information science, I want to talk about how these are used in information seeking. And so one of the ways that people use information seeking services is to look at health information. And we've studied a lot about how people do health information seeking. We know that it can impact people's willingness to go out and get help from a doctor. We know that it can be impactful with the relationship that a person has with their doctor. And we know that people use a lot of the signals about where the information is coming from to assess it. So they want to know if they can trust the health information they're getting online. They want to know where it's coming from. They want to make sure that they're understanding all the different components of it. And so this is a neat study that was done a few years back by some folks at UT Austin that looked at some of the criteria that people use to evaluate the quality of online health information. And if you look at this, a lot of the information here, or a lot of the criterion, are based on the source of the information. You know, whether a source or author has a sufficient level of knowledge, whether it presents facts, whether the source appears in multiple venues, right? All of these things related to source are very difficult for us to assess in a generative AI output, because the generative AI is not giving us the source where it found that information in its output. So that's a big concern. That's a big issue that we'll have to think through. I want to shift gears here, and in the last maybe 10 or 15 minutes of this talk, share with you some results of a study that I did earlier this year, where I actually had people come into our lab and do searches. Well, we did it virtually, so they were on Zoom, but we had people across Zoom do searches using a system that was a combination of a web search engine and a chatbot. So a lot of the work that I've done in my career has looked at tools to help people doing online searching. So often I do studies where I give people the ability to do searching over on the left side, and I put some tool over on the right side that's going to try to help searchers in their task. And so I've done a bunch of these. In this study, what I did is I put a chat AI window over on the side. And this chat AI window was basically wired up on the back end to the ChatGPT API. And so people here could have a conversation with ChatGPT. And I did a little bit of linking of things from here into the web search results. So this is kind of similar to what you would get with Bing, the new Bing. But I did this study before the new Bing was released. And if you're interested in more about this, I put the URL up here at the top. You can go to this URL and you can watch a video, and you can read the paper that we wrote about all this. Okay, so what we did is we gave people this interface, and we wanted to understand how they would integrate the AI chat into their search process. We wanted to see why they would engage with the AI chat, what they liked and disliked about it, whether they trusted the responses that came back from the AI chat. And we also wanted to see what their mental models were, and if they had an accurate mental model of how these responses were being generated. So this was a really quick study. Like I said, we were doing this in the spring of last year when all these AI services were just coming out. And so we ran a really quick study to get a look at this. We had 10 participants come in. They were all students at our university. They did 3 tasks. One was to learn about osmosis and diffusion. Another task was to understand metrics for stock investing. And then a third was to look at income disparity. And so we did these over Zoom. We recorded the screen while they did it. We asked them to think out loud while they were searching so we could analyze that data. We also did a interview at the end where we asked them some specific questions about how they used the search and how they used the AI system. And it took about 2 hours. And so we paid them we paid them $50 for roughly 2 hours. So whenever we do studies like this, one of the issues that you can run into is that if I'm giving participants a task to do in my study, it's not really their own task. They may not care about it as much as they would if it was their own task. And so to help overcome that, what we often do is we'll ask people, after you've found the information for this task, we're going to ask you to record a short video telling us what you learned. And so it just makes the task a little more tangible, a little more real to somebody. And so they are able to sort of engage with it a little more genuinely. So that's what we did in the study. We gave people 20 minutes to search for each task and then had them record the 2-minute video. So let me talk a little bit about what we found from this. So for our first research question about how people integrated chat into their search process, well, some people didn't. So there were a couple participants who just did not use the AI chat at all. They knew how to do web searching. That was what they knew, and they stayed with it. So that was fine. There were a few people who used the chat as a question answering tool. Now, what I mean by that is that they maybe were doing some searches on the web part, and they would be reading something on a web page and have a question come up. And so instead of doing a separate web search to try to address this question, they would just pop over to the chat and ask the chat to explain whatever their question was. And so they used it to get quick answers to questions that came up as they were searching. So that was a pretty interesting behavior. The other approach that we saw was what we called a chat first approach. And so in this, people actually started with the chat. They said, okay, I don't know anything about osmosis or diffusion, or I don't know anything about stock investing. So I'm going to ask the chat system how to get started. And the chat system's going to tell me a list of terms that I can use to then go search in the web search. And so that was a really interesting behavior too, because they would use the chat to kind of help them get the lay of the land, understand what search terms they might want to use, and then they would go over and do their own searching in the web search to check those things out. We also talked to people about why they engaged with the chat, why they chose to use it. So obviously some people said that they used it as a starting point because they either didn't remember that topic or it was an unfamiliar topic and they needed to find out how to get started. Some people said that it was easier to use the chat to extract information. So, you know, if you do your own web search, you've got to go look at those pages and read the text on those pages and extract the information out of them yourselves. But if you use the generative AI chat system, it does that for you. So they said they noticed that and they liked that. Interestingly, we saw a couple people who, when they were kind of getting towards the end of their 20 minutes, I gave them a 5-minute warning. And at that point, there were some people that started relying on the chat more than they had previously. So that was kind of interesting. So it suggests that in certain situations, we as humans may be more susceptible to just taking what the chat's telling us rather than verifying the output. Time pressure may be one of those situations. All right. Next, I want to talk about some of the things that people liked about the systems and some of the things they didn't like. They liked that it produced concise, easy to read, easy to understand answers. They liked that it synthesized the information for them. And they liked that it kind of encouraged them to have this back and forth natural language exchange with the system. And if you think about that, we know that in regular web search, most people are only typing a couple words to the search engine. But in the AI chat, they were typing more, right? let's see, Joyce, I see you're asking, did they use any AI search tools beyond the LLMs? So in this study, the only tool they had available was the one that I just showed you, where it was that little window off to the right side. So that was the only tool that they had available to them in this study. But I think it would be really interesting to do a study that looks at a more naturalistic environment where people are doing this, say, in their own homes or in their own computers. And I bet you would see some much richer sets of tools being used. So, definitely, I think that's happening in the world. It's just not what we studied here in this particular study. Yeah, I think introducing the search tools might make a difference. Definitely, definitely. And so when we did this study, part of what we wanted to do was understand if people knew the tool was there, how would they use it, right? So we were really kind of interested in how they would incorporate it and how they would use the tool. Not so much would they use it at all. So we were mostly interested in how they would use it. Okay, so some things that they were not liking about it. Almost universally, people talked about not liking the fact that it didn't give them access to the sources of the information. So we found this really encouraging. I mean, we're information scientists, and we want to think that the students out there in the world are good consumers of information, and at least at our university, that seemed to be the case with this sample of students. They wanted to see what the sources were, and they didn't like the fact that the chat wasn't showing it to them. So that's something that we saw some of the systems are trying to work on. They're trying to provide more access to sources. They're having kind of a mixed success with that, but it's definitely something that people wanted. A couple other things that people didn't like. In some cases, they talked about the answers as being too general, right? That they wanted more specific information. They felt like it was too sort of synthesized or pre-processed. They also noticed there was some repetition in the answers. So even if they would change their wording around, sometimes the chat would generate a similar answer to what it had generated before. And they didn't like that. Few other things they didn't like. Some people got some contradictory answers. And so, there was one time where somebody pointed this out and said, hey, the system just contradicted that thing. The way we implemented our system, it didn't have any pictures or videos or any other kind of shopping or any of those kind of things included in that. And so people pointed that out. They didn't like that it didn't have those things in them. And the last thing on here is we did something where if you typed in a search query in the search box, we also sent that over to the chat. And so we thought that would be a helpful thing, because if you searched for it in the search side, starting a chat on that topic might be helpful. Some people felt like that was kind of forcing them into using it. And so that was an interesting one. Now, we asked them at the end, did they trust the AI chat? And most people said no. They used it, but they didn't trust it. And so a lot of people talked about how they had felt like the results sounded reasonable, but they had some doubts about them. So, it didn't produce any output that sounded crazy, but I'm not 100% sure that I trust this. So the sort of motto of don't trust but verify came up quite a bit in our interviews. And in some cases, this depended on how familiar a person was with the topic. So if it was a topic that they were really familiar with and the system was producing things that they knew to be true, they started to trust it more. Now, what's kind of tricky about that is in some cases, these might have been topics that I was sort of familiar with. And so maybe two of the things sounded familiar to me and I was pretty sure those were right. Maybe I would go ahead and trust the third thing that it told me, but maybe that third thing wouldn't be right, right? And so these kinds of problems with familiarity, I think, is a real issue that we have in assessing the output of these systems, right? That we may trick ourselves into thinking it's producing valid output because we see one or two things that we know are correct, and then that third thing that we don't know about, we just assume is correct. So that's something to be aware of.
Rob, there was one other question about age distribution of the participants.
Oh, yeah. So these were university students. They did range in age from, about 18 to about 30. So they were pretty young. But they also, most of the people in the study were aware of ChatGPT at the time. Remember, this was back in March of this year. And so they were aware of it, and some of them had played with it, but it was not widespread at the time we did this study. So, yeah. Joyce, I'm going to come back to your comment in a minute because I think it's a really interesting comment, but I want to finish out this slide and the next one, and then I'm going to come back. So we asked them if they had a mental model of where the output was coming from and how it was being produced. And at that point in time, in March of this year, most people said, no, I don't know how this is being produced. Some people had some misconceptions. Some people thought that the web searching they did over on the left side was influencing the content of the chat, which was not necessarily the case. And so another thing people talked about was that they were unsure what sources the chat had access to. Like, did it have access to things behind a paywall? Or did it have access to, a New York Times articles or things like that? And so they weren't really sure how these responses were being generated by the chat. So in short, we saw people using the chat quite a bit. We saw them using it in some really useful ways to get started, to get summaries, to answer questions. We saw them saying that they didn't really trust it, but they used it. And so that was kind of encouraging. But we also felt like there were some cases where they relied on those chat responses because they were short on time or because they were influenced by the chat responses. And so the idea of helping people to assess the information that's coming out of a chat system is going to be very, very important going forward. All right. So I think I will stop on that one. And Joyce, your question is a really, really interesting one. I'll repeat this so that people can see it. I'm thinking that chat is not really search. And you point to a site that you've been introducing this to your students. I think the idea of chat and search as being two separate things or one thing or distinct things is going to get very fuzzy in the next little bit, because people are using some of these systems to ask questions and get potential answers back. If we sort of think about the history back in the day, you would go to a library and you'd have to talk to a reference librarian and get books and read those books and assess those books and get the information yourself. And then we had the internet that could go and retrieve those documents for us, but we still had to read the documents and assess them and extract the information. And now this GPT system is trying to just give us an answer, right? And so I think that's a really interesting point. If you want to elaborate, I'd love to hear more about what your thoughts were.
Yeah, thank you, Rob. This has been wonderful. I'm like, I haven't seen very many studies, and I really appreciate your reading my comments. I've been really focusing on this with my master's students in my search course, and sometimes all of Bing and Google and the other search engines, you cannot avoid AI intrusion into search. And sometimes it doesn't matter. Like if I really want a review of a movie that I want to see on Friday night, maybe it doesn't matter. But if I'm writing an academic paper, then I'm going to lead them to Perplexity and Elicit and Consensus. and a number
Right.
of other tools, just as I would when they were looking, I wanted to lead them to various different databases. And,
Right.
I think it's a different, there are different tools for different tasks. And
Yeah.
right now we're looking at new models for where we go when. And I think that's really important. And I honestly, and there are other tools for research that, are not even in the class of search tools. They're interacting with research. So if we look at how, like Chat PDF, how we interact with documents. So we get medical reviews that we need to look at, and maybe we don't have the capacity for interpreting the content, but we can interact with these documents now because they can be interpreted, they can be translated into multiple languages, they can
Right.
be simplified. All of this stuff is something to be excited about with a little bit of reservation.
Right.
But I think that we need to look at the entire genre of new tools for search, rather than, I think a lot of folks are just looking at Bard and ChatGPT and the large language models that we've seen. But in doing that, we ignore some of the real wonderful advances that we might be looking at.
Yeah, and I think there's so many opportunities there, right? I mean, when these tools started to come out, late last year, beginning of this year, I was just giddy with thinking about all the opportunities that there are for our field as information professionals, to try to help people to use these tools in really productive ways. But the key thing that I think you said there is that because of the hallucinations, because of the alignment issues and things like that, we really have to teach people how to assess what's coming out of these tools and use them in a way that's going to be productive to their ultimate information goals and information needs, and not lead them to just accept the answer that's coming back, which is a very tempting thing to do sometimes when you've got this nice paragraph of text that the generative AI just produced. I wanted to touch, Roman, I saw that you had a comment about information literacy, and I think that is extremely important. What we saw, I totally think that our participants were not representative of the whole population. We had university students at a major US university. And so, these are kids that had been taught to be critical of information sources probably since they were in high school. But what was interesting was I saw a lot of the skills, the information literacy skills that they had learned for the web, transferring over into their use of the GPT system. And they were frustrated that they couldn't use some of those skills, right? So they couldn't find out what the sources were to evaluate the source information. But they were using the GPT system to help get started or get hooks that they could do searching on. And so I would love to redo the study that we did with different populations and see what kind of results came out of that, because I'm guessing they would be very different. Isaac, you asked a really good question too. Isaac asked about to what extent chat generated information could be acceptable or used in a PhD dissertation. The part of this presentation that I didn't have time for was I served on a committee this summer across our entire university that tried to answer questions just like that. We tried to say, what are we going to tell our students they can do or not do with these technologies when they're in classes in the fall? And this was for undergraduates, master's students, and PhD students that we talked about this. We also talked about what can we as responsible researchers do with these tools, and what do we have to disclose? And the basics that came out of that were, these tools are great for helping, but we can't have them do the thinking for us, right? So there's a lot of ways to use these tools that I think are very productive. But at the end of the day, if I use a tool to generate some text and then I go and try to share that text with you, I'm responsible, right? I've put that text out to the world, and I'm responsible for that text. And so I have to make sure that I've checked it out. I have to make sure that I haven't plagiarized somebody. I have to make sure that it's accurate and all those things. And so that's kind of what we've been basing a lot of our policies on. Not we definitely at our school do not want students to ignore this technology. We don't want them to use it but don't tell us about it. We don't want to put our heads in the sand. We want them to understand the technology and how it can be used, because we think that it's going to be important for them in a competitive marketplace. I mean, they're employers that are going to be asking them how do they know how to use these technologies so they can do their jobs better. And so we need to be the ones that are trying to help train them how to use these technologies responsibly. So that's a great question. Let's see, I'm going down the list here. Verity, you asked about SEO. This is a really interesting question. I'm going to take your question and flip it a little bit. So imagine what happens with SEO now, that companies are vying to place their search results higher on a search result page, and Google is selling keywords and things like that, right? What happens when we start having that with generative AI? So imagine that a generative AI system starts selling placement of products in the output that it generates. So that's an interesting twist on where we are now. So, the question that you were really asking there, though, was how do the LLMs weight the information that's on the pages? I don't have a clear answer to that for you. And I don't know that people that create the systems can definitively explain that either. That's one of the interesting things about these systems, is that even the people that have been developing them have been surprised by some of their capabilities. And so how do they rank something higher, or how do they choose? It's probabilistic, right? But how do we know whether one site is having a greater influence over that output or not? I'm guessing that a lot of people are going to be studying that because they want to know the answer.
I'm going to jump in and make sure we have time to thank Dr. Capra for his presentation. Thank you very much. I'm going to turn off recording. We do have a few more minutes if there are any other questions.
It's really great to talk with all of you. Thanks for coming.